Okay, welcome and good afternoon. I'm Jessica Berg. I'm the dean here at the law school, and I'm going to welcome you to the 2015 Sugarman Lecture in Nonprofit Law. Just to tell you a little bit about the lecture itself, Norman Sugarman was one of our graduates. He graduated first in his class in 1940 and was elected to Order of the Coif. He was the recipient of the Fletcher Reed Andrews Outstanding Alumnus Award and was elected to the Society of Benchers in recognition of his contributions to the legal profession. Mr. Sugarman had a long career in the Internal Revenue Service, which was capped by him being named an assistant commissioner. He was the first IRS employee to be named an assistant commissioner. It was a tribute to both his intellectual and technical skills. After leaving the IRS to join Baker Hostetler in 1954, he became a nationally recognized tax law expert, particularly with respect to tax-exempt organizations. More importantly, he was considered a superb educator. He gave speeches all over the country and had the rare ability to present complex topics in simple and understandable terms, something we value in all of our educators. After his death in 1986, Baker Hostetler, his partners individually, his clients, and his friends established a memorial fund. It was thought the best way to honor his memory was to continue his teaching. And so in part, the fund is used to establish this memorial lecture. So we are very pleased today to have our speaker, who will be introduced by one of our professors in the Department of History. David Hammack is the Hiram C. Hayden Professor of History. He's been very involved in nonprofit organizations throughout his entire time here at the university, and he's graciously agreed to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to introduce Mark Seidel as Sugarman Lecturer. The extent, quality, and variety of Mark's career makes this assignment both easy and, given that I have 3 minutes only, very challenging. After learning Chinese and Vietnamese and winning history degrees from Princeton and Yale, Mark earned a JD at Columbia. He then served on the team that established the Ford Foundation's office in Beijing, moved on to Hanoi to develop all of Ford's Vietnam programs, and then to New Delhi as manager of Ford's South Asia program on philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. Along the way, he also practiced law with Baker and McKenzie in New York, Beijing, and Hong Kong, and he's provided advice on human rights to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and to leading entities in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. In the U.S., Mark has served as consultant to the U.S. State Department on human trafficking and labor law issues, and has been litigative as consultant to the U.S. Department of Justice in the largest prosecution of slavery, human trafficking, and involuntary servitude since the Civil War. Given all this, it follows that Mark Seidel is active with the International Center for Nonprofit Law, which has honored him with a major award, with the Community Foundation's National Standards Board of the Council on Foundations and Human Rights Watch Asia, and that he won the Outstanding Academic Award from the Nonprofit Organizations Committee of the American Bar Association Business Law Section. I can testify from close personal observation that he has excelled as recent past president of the International Society for Third Sector Research and as a current member of the board of the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. Among Mark's dozen books are several titles such as Regulation of the Voluntary Sector, Freedom and Security in an Age of Uncertainty, but also among his titles is Old Hanoi, published by Oxford University Press, a book cited by various references as both authoritative and beautifully illustrated. Currently Doyle-Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin, Mark Seidel has been visiting professor or distinguished lecturer at Harvard Law School, Melbourne Law School, Sciences Po in Paris, the University of London, the new Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, and half a dozen more. I'm very much looking forward to his Sugarman lecture here at Case Western Reserve.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We tried to do this back in the spring, as colleagues and friends know, and air travel and O'Hare did not cooperate, so I'm delighted to be back to try it again. My thanks first to David and to Jessica. To David for that introduction. I have no idea who he's talking about, but I appreciate it nonetheless. David, as many of you know, since you're around here and have heard his name before, is our leading scholar of nonprofit organizations and philanthropic history in the United States. And it's a particular honor to be introduced by him today and to have him here. I look forward to any comments he'd like to make. I also very much appreciate the work that Jonathan Enton, Matt Rossman, Jessica, and others have done to enable this to happen, and I'm delighted to talk with you today. I'm beginning some work on community foundations after having observed them for many years, both in the United States and abroad. It's an American philanthropic innovation, as I say in the title, which is up on your various screens in this beautiful refurbished room, that has spread around the world. But it's spread around the world in very different ways. Adaptation and innovation take place in very different ways as they move not only through countries, but across countries and across borders as well. And so in the short time available, I'll talk a bit about that after talking a bit about the US scene. Cleveland is a particularly auspicious place to be talking about community foundations and the 100 years of community foundations in the United States. As probably all of you know, if you're here today, the Community Foundation and Trust movement had its start in Cleveland with Frederick Goff and others, and particularly Frederick Goff, in 1914. The legal basis for community foundations in the United States has been a special form with special rules. And one of the perhaps, maybe, interesting things today is that while I'm talking as a lawyer and I'm talking in a law school, there may not be that much law here. The problems that American community foundations face today are perhaps not fundamentally legal in nature. The structure that was set up by Frederick Goff and his colleagues in Cleveland that spread across the country has been a persistent structure that has been sustainable and relatively strong. It has some interesting features to it that we can discuss. But as I said, the problems are problems of what community foundations stand for, what they do, what their purpose is, a delicate question of purpose, to quote David Hammack here to my left, and a range of questions that I'll raise today. The legal issues are there, but they are not most prominent in the world of American community foundations. The adaptations I'll talk about briefly as well, and adaptations is where I'm going with this work, adaptations to substantial challenges in the United States, but also adaptations abroad. As David, who gave that unfortunate introduction, so now I will quote him as well. Community foundations, as it says up there, and all your screens have become so numerous and diverse that it is impossible to pin them down to particular organizational forms or animating purposes. And that's because in the United States, the idea of place-based philanthropy has been a particularly resonant idea. The idea that people would gather together in their communities to improve the quality of life within a geographic area and in many cases beyond as well, independent in most cases of existing philanthropic entities, governed by a board which is at least broadly representative and often not representative enough of the communities they serve, that make grants to nonprofit groups rather than primarily carrying out programs on their own, that seek to build endowments, often through donor funds from families and individuals, and the struggle to build endowment, as one of the articles for those of you who are here as part of the CLE process have in your packet, the struggle to build endowment is in some ways the persistent struggle of American community foundations. And that have engaged in a wide variety of grant making and other activities in their communities to try to transform their communities for the better. That's a very hard task. And community foundations at various points in this 100 years of history that began in 1914 have struggled with their community function and their role to try to better and transform their communities. But when this process started, this was one of the great new innovations in the American philanthropic world. It was, as David and others have discussed, a break, a separation from religious philanthropy. It was a focus on giving in place, not necessarily a wealthy family based in Cleveland or New York giving across the country, although community foundations could facilitate that too, but the goal was to give back and to better one's own community. And as an idea, it took off across the country. The secularization of philanthropy, of which community foundations, the community foundation movement have been a part, the notion of giving in place, the tying of philanthropy directly to social change, at least in some cases. And while this was not only a hallmark of community foundations, it has been a hallmark of many community foundations. Preserving and using family and individual wealth through donor-advised funds, through community foundations, and finding new ways to govern philanthropic organizations in at least some representative form. This was not the only philanthropic innovation of its era. We have community chests, we have United Ways, and in this, Cleveland was a pioneer in every particular form of new philanthropy in the United States, something that David and others have written about quite extensively. From those origins, we now have well over 700 community foundations in the United States. The last year for which we have full figures, 2014, you see the figures on the board. The figures look high, but actually this is, in a world dominated by private foundations in the United States, this is only 9% of foundation assets in the United States. The vast majority are private, not community foundation assets, meaning foundations established by individuals and families and that often bear their names and that are still, in many cases, run by the families. But with 10% of US foundation giving at the local level, and at times, not at all times, but at times, community foundations have outpaced their level of giving. They have arguably had more impact on the communities in which they work than those 9 and 10% figures would show. The range is enormous. We have many community foundations in the United States that are small, and dozens, or perhaps, depending on your definitions, perhaps up to several hundred that you might consider to be struggling in nature. They may have assets of $100,000, $150,000. And if those are not pass-through funds, if those are funds held in endowment on which only a certain proportion, say 5%, can be used for annual income, then, as a wonderful report on community foundations pointed out in 2005, the Bernholz report, revenues do not always meet expenses, especially when these organizations want to undertake their primary philanthropic task, which is to make grants to other organizations. So we have a large number of relatively small community foundations among this group of 763 in 2014, now up into the 770s, 780s as of 2015. We also have extraordinarily large community foundations, of which the Silicon Valley Community Foundation is one, and there are a number of others around the country. The competitors have grown as well, certainly not all. In fact, a relatively small proportion of American philanthropic donations over the past 100 years have actually gone into community foundations. The United Way movement, community chests, which declined over time, especially private foundations, and of course direct charitable giving to a wide range of other organizations, whether it's Case Western Reserve University or the Girl Scouts or lots of other organizations, thousands, tens of thousands of other organizations around the country. But we have seen a certain growth in community foundations, as well as a certain growth among the competitor institutions, at least what I call the competitor institutions, and a huge growth in the private foundation context. There are still many Americans, upper middle class and wealthy, that seek to have their own foundation, that have not yet taken advantage of some of the forms available through establishing a fund through the Cleveland Foundation or other foundations. And this is something that community foundations struggle with all the time. So for me, the stories of American community foundations, as I begin some research and writing on this that I hope will eventually result in a book, is really the story of two different outcomes, but of course there's never two different outcomes, there's a spectrum of outcomes. We have community foundations that have grown, that have engaged in social innovation, whatever we might each mean by that, and that have had impact and influence in their communities. And we have community foundations, including one that I served on the board for about 4 or 5 years, and that I loved serving on the board for, which are small, which have grown only very slowly, which probably would self-define as not engaging in innovative practices, and which, at least I would say, if not all my former colleagues would say, have probably struggled to have some impact and influence in their communities other than as a kind of regular annual funder for social services and other organizations, and that's a crucially important task. So we have, in effect, two adaptive stories. We have a story of great success, not necessarily tied to asset growth, endowment growth, and we have a story of organizations that over time have struggled a bit to figure out what their role in their communities are. So the results, 100 years later, as I say up on the board, community foundations are significant convening, innovation, and impact actors in some locations. Cleveland would certainly be among them. And others. When I was here last time, when the lecture didn't work, we did, as some of you know, certainly Jonathan and Matt and David, who was there, and others, we did an event at the Cleveland Club. I'm sorry, I apologize. City Club of Cleveland, with community foundation leaders from around the region. And the stories that we were hearing from them about their actual experiences were in this area, stories of convening, innovation, and impact. But that's not necessarily true throughout the country. A number of scholars have warned of these issues over the years. Great successes for some community foundations, but difficulty in raising funds for others, difficulty in innovation, difficulty in social impact for others. David, who's here, is one of them, but there's a number of others as well, including most recently a terrific book published 3 or 4 years ago by Perry and Mazzani, actually on the actual 100th anniversary of community foundations, which was 2014. So as I begin academic work on this, I am reading what lots of people have written on this, my own experience working as a board member in a community foundation and now serving on the Community Foundations National Standards Board, which establishes self-regulatory standards for community foundations around the country. I've come up with several different challenges which at least I've directly experienced or that community foundation leaders have told me about or that I see playing out in other parts of the world where this tremendous philanthropic innovation of a place-based community philanthropy run by people from the place has taken hold. One of those is the challenges of donors. Not only getting donors. We sometimes think if you see a phrase called the challenges of donors, that the challenges of donors are in getting the donors. In the community foundation context, as in so many other contexts, the challenges of donors go far beyond the process of actually getting donors to establish funds at your community foundation or to give to the ongoing expenses of the community foundation. Community foundations in recent decades have been largely dependent on what we call donor-advised funds. which are not funds that provide for complete flexibility for the community foundation to use income from those funds as they wish for the betterment of the communities. Frederick Goff's basic innovative invention was the idea that people would establish funds and give to community foundations, and that the community-based board of trustees or board of contributors would decide, based on the income from those endowments, what makes sense to give to in the community. The donor-advised funds movement in the United States is a much more limited undertaking. Donors, including probably some in this room, give to community foundations, and they retain some influence, not legal control, but they retain some influence on how their donations will be spent. Twice a year, 4 times a year, the Cleveland Foundation or other foundations will write to them and say, you have a donor-advised fund. You may not decide where the income from your fund goes, but you have the right to advise. And in most cases, I think the community foundation participants here today would say in virtually all cases, community foundations are following that so-called advice. For the law students in the room, it can't be control, because as part of the process of setting up the donor-advised fund in the community foundation, the donors have taken a tax deduction. That means that control over those funds has passed out of the donor hands and into the hands of the community foundations. But to some degree, the idea of donor-advised funds is a kind of legal fiction. In 90%, 95%, 98% of cases, community foundations are not flouting the wishes of their donors. They are following the wishes of their donors. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It has led to major asset growth in American community foundations. But it has also at times limited what community foundations can do, and bringing together large blocks of money to do truly transformative things in their community. So donors are both a boon and in this way a challenge, especially in recent decades where the rise of what we call donor-advised funds has both fueled the growth of community foundations, but at times limited the flexibility that they have to gather funds together and to do truly transformative work in their community. So as it says at the bottom, there are now questions in different parts of the country for different community foundations about what the value proposition is for the community foundation movement today. The second challenge is one of community. What we mean by community in the United States is probably a bit more complicated than what Frederick Goff and his colleagues thought was meant by community when they started the Cleveland Foundation 101 years ago. And community foundations have, and I don't think I'm going too far, struggled to figure out what community means, how they serve their communities, and how they do things that, with limited funding, can have significant impacts on the communities they serve. One might think, actually none of you would think, but I'm setting it up this way, one might think that this shouldn't be that hard. You're working in a county, you're working in a city. You're not working in Idaho, you're not working in Madison, Wisconsin, where I come from. You're working in one place. How hard should social impact be in one community? A county that might have 500,000 people? Well, the answer is, of course, and you all know this, I don't need to say it, that's a really hard question. Figuring out social impact from a philanthropic perspective is very, very difficult. And so those challenges of community, what community means, which communities we're serving, which communities get to decide how we serve, has been a very difficult question. Should community foundations, in terms of the challenges of community, be merely a conduit for funds by donors? Should they be somewhat more? And I put down 4 different ideas that have emerged at different times: collaboration, community convening, and community leadership. And the emphasis on local knowledge, I'll talk a bit more about this at the end if we have some time, but these are ideas that have come up repeatedly in the community foundation world as to what community foundations might bring to the table that differ from private family foundations, that differ from the institutions, in some cases, that community foundations and other philanthropic entities make grants to. Is our strength collaboration and collective action through networks? Is our strength community convening and providing community leadership as a neutral, not uninterested, but a neutral or somewhat neutral actor? Is our continuing advantage that we understand our communities better than almost anyone else can as an institution and the full breadth of problems? Or is our advantage that we provide tax advantages for donors who want to retain some influence over the use of their funds, but don't want to establish the Gates Foundation, a private, well, that's not the best example, but a private foundation, a private family foundation that they run themselves? Is that, at the end of the day, the most important feature of American community foundations? All of this is related to the idea and the problem of community in the United States. And finally, and this runs through each of the other challenges and runs through everything I'm going to say today, is the difficulty in getting to impact and innovation. This is a difficulty throughout the American philanthropic community, trying to figure out through careful and committed programming what kinds of philanthropic grants or other philanthropic activities can actually have impact and innovation. At a time when, for many institutions, not just community foundations, the assets that are available, especially in a world of donor-advised funds, are in many cases not high enough to have that impact and innovation either by oneself or sometimes in collaboration. And so what we see are challenges that beset an innovation and have forced adaptation in new directions. The Cleveland Foundation and other community foundations around Cleveland have been leaders in trying to adapt their ways out of these tripartite challenges. These are the ways I define the challenges. Other people have defined the challenges in other ways. David, for example, wrote some years ago, perhaps long enough ago that he may have even forgotten the chapter, about the delicate question of purpose, as I mentioned before, in American community foundations. That's, I think, related to each of these conundra that the community foundation sector faces. Closely related to the problem of donors and closely related to the problem of impact and innovation is that community foundations have always had tremendous competition for donor funds. I will not read this list. First, because the basic principle, the basic mantra is don't read your PowerPoint, but also because it would be a particular cruelty to read this list to you. Lester Solomon and colleagues edited and put together a book that was published in 2014 about all of these new models and new uses of financial instruments for philanthropy, not to make money, but for philanthropy. How fixed income securities are being used for philanthropic purposes. How online portals and exchanges, actually many of you are familiar with this, global giving and other ways of giving money online. Social impact bonds, which I know have had some history here in Cleveland as well. These are all new models, new innovations in philanthropy, innovations that are newer than the community foundations, which have been around for 101 years, but they're also competitors for donor dollars. And that makes, at times, the world of being in a community foundation and the role of the community foundation more complicated. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the work of the Community Foundations National Standards Board and my colleagues on the Community Foundations National Standards Board, which is based at the U.S. Council on Foundations in Greater Washington, D.C., would be annoyed with me. But it's interesting that in the world of American giving, in the world of American philanthropy, a world dominated by private foundations like the Ford Foundation and others, that community foundations have become the one sector within this community which has an effective working form of what we call self-regulation. Private foundations do not have a way of regulating themselves effectively. That may be related to the fact that, as many of you know, in legal terms, private foundations are pretty highly regulated, first by Congress and then by the Internal Revenue Service, and in some cases only, by the states as well. But community foundations, beginning about a decade and a half ago, actually got together and established a form of self-governance, a form of self-regulation. Some of the themes are at the second bullet point there, but the question for me, and it's actually the key question when I was asked to join the National Standards Board, is why community philanthropy, why community foundations would emerge as the one successful forum for self-regulation in which a group of philanthropic entities plays a role in governing itself. Obviously, the Internal Revenue Service governs it as well. Obviously, state charitable authorities, depending on the state you're in, govern community foundations as well. Why a self-regulatory mechanism? And of course, one of the reasons for all self-regulatory mechanisms, as I, but lots of others have written about, is to bolster legitimacy and accountability in the fields in which self-regulation takes place. A way of increasing one's legitimacy and accountability in the eyes of donors and giving a certain subsector, for example here, community foundations, a certain advantage in the struggle for donors and donations. That's one set of reasons for self-regulation. There may be other reasons, other motivations as well, but the fact remains that in this already curious sector of community foundations, a great American philanthropic innovation, this is the only example of effective, strong self-regulation that we have. This idea that began in the United States has now spread across the world. Depending on definitions and how you count, and whether you count affiliates and branches and all kinds of definitional questions which are neither interesting nor important here today, there are somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 community foundations or community foundation-like entities around the world. And when I say around the world, I mean everywhere. From the most developed, most prosperous economies in Europe and elsewhere, through Latin America, through the Middle East, now in China, developing very rapidly, across Asia, across Africa. Different numbers, of course, and they have developed more quickly in some areas. But this idea of a community foundation, place-based giving entity, which is in some form run by citizens themselves within their communities, has spread across the world. The adaptations, however, have been both very different and at times very difficult. American private foundations and others, led by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, have played a significant role in helping this innovation, this community foundation innovation emigrate from the United States and establish itself in other parts of the world. But the ways in which it emigrates to other places and sets up in other places has to respond to local needs. And those local needs have determined not only what community foundations do in other countries, but how they operate and, of course, the legal structure in which they operate. So in the United Kingdom, just to give a few very brief examples, in the United Kingdom, we had about 48 community foundations in 2014, and the British colleagues who work on community foundations, and there's a small and vibrant group, which David and others know, that works on community foundations in the UK, point out that they think that the two main successes of community-based philanthropy groups like community foundations in the UK has been providing philanthropic advice to wealthy donors and providing a giving vehicle to wealthy donors and large institutions. And I've named a couple of those here. A focus not only on philanthropic leadership, but through the work of those donors, direct work in social services with communities. But community foundations, despite the formation of 48 such entities, assets remain relatively low, And it's been difficult for the idea of place-based giving to develop as rapidly in the UK for whatever reasons, and I'll be exploring this more in my work, as it has in the United States. Much more successful, much larger, many more institutions in Germany. Now over 350 active community foundations, substantial asset base, substantial giving, still with a focus on giving for social services in communities, which is itself a good thing, probably not yet reached the transformative impact that community foundations have always wanted to reach, but other than Germany, we actually know relatively little about what's happening with the community foundation movement. Despite a lot of counting and a lot of conferences, we actually know very little about what's happening on the ground, especially beyond Germany, where there's been some research in the rest of Europe, where we see community philanthropy, especially community foundations, growing and growing rapidly. We need to know much more about what it's doing. In other countries where this idea has spread explicitly as an American philanthropic innovation that spread abroad. I have direct experience because of Ford with working with the smaller nascent community foundation sector in India, which is led by highly active, highly enthusiastic, vibrant people in cities like Mumbai, Bombay, and Ahmedabad, who run small community foundations that have had tremendous trouble growing. Is that because the idea of place-based giving doesn't resonate in those cities? The answer to that almost certainly appears to be no. Philanthropic giving in general is expanding extraordinarily rapidly in India. But the idea of a community foundation, excuse me, in which people come together to give into a joint entity, even if the funds are named for the individual families and donors, has not caught hold in India, at least so far, the way it has in other places. Now, we have 100 years of experience in this in the United States, in Australia, the UK, Germany. They have 20, 30, 40 years of experience. The Indian experience is somewhat newer. It's about 20 years old, and so it may still develop rapidly. But philanthropic giving, which is growing, as I said, extraordinarily rapidly in India, is currently based with families and corporate entities, and there seems to be relatively little motivation to give into place-based giving entities. Are those questions of trust? Are those questions of credit, donor credit, meaning how much moral and other credit donors get? That research has not yet been done. The newest area, and one that has received a tremendous amount of attention relative to the relatively small number of entities, and certainly their tiny assets, is China, but that's because China gets a lot of attention for almost anything that happens in the philanthropic sector or anything else these days. China began to establish community foundations, again, based on this idea of the American philanthropic innovation moving abroad. About 10 years ago, for those of you who want to look them up, I've named a couple of the nascent Chinese community foundations at the bottom of the screen. And it's much too early to know whether in China, where philanthropy is also growing extraordinarily rapidly, as some of you know, whether place-based giving in which families and individuals come together to form funds and a broad foundation to benefit their community, whether that idea, started in Cleveland in 1914, will really resonate in the Chinese context. Those who work on community foundations in China are both optimistic because they see the tremendous growth of philanthropic giving, especially by the Chinese middle class, which is also growing very quickly, as you know, and the Chinese wealthy. But at the same time, they're worried about whether this kind of model can actually take root in China in a situation in which most giving is based, as it is in most countries, on trust, and most people want to keep giving and the control over giving within their families. So after 100 years of adaptation in the American model, of which we've only sort of skirted the surface of today, We obviously face another century of change and adaptation in the American Community Foundation and community philanthropy model here. It's impossible to know, of course, what that 100 years will bring, the next century of American community foundations, but it will certainly bring increased questions about donor competition and where donors want to give their money. Will this form, this historic form, this historic Cleveland form, eventually wither away, go from 9% or 10% of foundation giving down toward the 5, 6, 7% area, and then gradually become less important over time? Or will it experience, as it has, for example, in parts of California and other parts of the country, a tremendous resurgence as new wealth moves into community giving vehicles? Will community foundations figure out, in the face of competition for donor funds and the tremendous proportion of donor giving, which now runs through what you might call semi-controlled donor-advised funds, will they figure out a way of having impact and innovation in the communities they serve beyond the impact and innovation they're currently having? These are questions to some degree of philanthropic adaptation. They're questions that David and others have written about. They're questions about philanthropic adaptation that go far beyond the community foundation context. Private foundations need to adapt. The United Way movement has needed to adapt tremendously, as some of you know, who either work with United Ways or have studied United Ways. That problem of philanthropic adaptation is a tremendous set of issues for the American philanthropic community. But as community foundations over the next several decades, I don't want to say next 100 years, think about their roles, there's already been some very good thinking by people who have either researched the field or worked within it about what community foundations might think about as their roles going forward. Thinking carefully about purpose. This is something that David urged on the community foundation movement. 1989 was when that chapter was published, if I have that correct. But thinking carefully about that delicate question of purpose and what purpose means for community foundations. That was a relatively novel question at that moment. It's no longer a novel question today. Thinking about what networks and alliances, these are buzzwords today, but they are buzzwords which are crucially important to the future of the American Community Foundation movement, especially in the vast parts of the country and the vast majority of the over 700 community foundations that do not have the asset base, especially where most of the assets are now based in donor-advised funds, to have impact and innovation on their own. What that networking and alliance building will mean. What it means to be a place leader, as one of the commentators on community foundations calls it, in a new era. Will community foundations continue to be and expand their role as what Perry and Mazzani call repositories of understanding, knowledge, and expertise? Or what others have called the repositories of local knowledge. What Laurie Slutsky, who runs the New York Community Trust, calls the patient capital in local communities that can take time to have, hopefully, transformative social impact within those communities. And over the next 20, 30, 40 years, into the second century of American community foundations, donors will be crucial. Individual and family donors have always been the basis for American community foundations. Corporates have given to community foundations, but it's been individual and family donors. How those donors will give to community foundations in the future, will they continue to keep hold through the donor-advised funds process on how a significant portion of their capital is used, or will over time community foundations have more flexible capital to try to achieve community impact and innovation? Norman Sugarman warned of these issues in 1975 as he was coming toward the end of a career in which he had been the crucial lawyer for American community foundations, as Paul Feinberg and others here today know very well. But he was a lawyer who understood that the key conundrum, the key policy issues for American community foundations went beyond the innovative legal framework that Frederick Goff had started and that Norman Sugarman himself had pioneered in his work with the Internal Revenue Service in the 1960s and early 1970s. He spoke in 1975 of needing to justify their special privileges as public charities, in which they are regulated less, so it's a very broad term, but they are regulated less strictly than private foundations like the Ford Foundation in the United States. The need to justify their privileges as public charities and the need to lead by building adequate staffs. That was an issue in 1975. We may not think of it as an issue for today, although many smaller foundations don't have the money for any staff. By building adequate staff, by fulfilling the need for broad-based participation from within their communities, and early warning of the problems of representation and legitimacy in community foundations and in communities where often decisions were being made in the 70s and after, and of course before, by a relatively small elite. Providing leadership in support for private philanthropy, not following the field but leading the field, and encouraging greater participation by the involvement of more citizens in foundation efforts. This was a clarion call in 1975 for trying to think both more deeply and more innovatively about what community foundations in the United States could become, and Sugarman was the leader in the attempts to push that process forward. Obviously, those challenges persist today. Those responsibilities for community foundations continue, and they're likely to prove even more complicated over the next 20, 30 years, even as this great American philanthropic innovation continues its emigration and adaptation abroad. And let me stop there and answer a few questions. Thank you.
Mark, you spoke about the challenge of measuring social impact and community foundations needs the need to stay aware of social impact and to be guided by it, to be challenged by the need to continue to adhere to it in their operations. As you've started to study community foundations and maybe even in your experience working with them, have you seen particular